Hello everybody, welcome to the livecast. We're not live, but we are in person because with me in the studio is Paul Feesey. Hello.
Whoop, hello, back in the building. Here I am.
Yeah, back in the studio space. And you guys, you can't see it now, but on the far side of the studio, we are set up for our new series called Reset.
It's coming soon.
Yeah.
Coming soon.
All about coming back to the beginning, and we're going to start in Genesis 4 and move our way backwards to, in the beginning, God. And we've got some pretty impressive guests. Who have we got? Can you remember some of the people we've got?
Yeah, so we've got Douglas Murray.
Right.
We've got John Lennox.
Yeah.
We've got Tom Holland.
Wow.
So there's some big names. We've got Rupert Sheldrake.
Yes.
Awesome
Awesome
name. So
name.
you spoke to today, actually, didn't you?
Professor Rupert Sheldrake, who has invented a scientific concept called morphic resonance, which is like, it's like if that was in Doctor Who, it would not be out of place.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely
Morphic resonance.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to hear lots from them in those interviews. And then, there's other people, Esther O'Reilly.
Yeah.
And then Catherine Burble Singh.
Right.
So, loads of people, loads of people. Probably there'll be names you recognise, some you won't, but they're all going to be great.
So Christians and non-Christians, because we want to pitch this at those who are noticing that there's a little bit of a meaning crisis and starting to wonder whether actually the ancient original origin story of the Bible might have something to say to our meaning crisis today. And one of the things we thought we'd do in our episode today is talk about this kind of phenomenon of people recognizing that Christianity has shaped the West, and therefore we are more Christian than we think.
Yep.
So we've come up with three different representatives of three different kinds of Christian atheism, or secular Christianity. And we've got Slavoj Zizek, the Slovenian lecturer, academic. We've got Douglas Murray, editor of The Spectator and author of many books. And we've got Tom Holland, author of many books, including Dominion.
Yeah.
But where should we begin? I think we should probably begin with Slavoj Zizek.
Sure.
Because he is, I guess he is this kind of impish misanthrope. In the mold of Ricky Gervais, I kind of think...
What is a misanthrope, Glen?
Yes.
For those of us that aren't you.
Come on, Paul. You know you're Greek. You know Greek.
Is it something to do with people?
Miso is the verb that means...
I
hate.
Oh, yeah, hating of people.
Right.
Yeah. Anthropology.
A philanthrope is a
lover of
people.
People.
See?
Lover, not a hater.
Exactly.
I'm a philo, not a meso.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, Slavoj, he's an interesting guy. He's very jolly with it. He's kind of he has a jolly, tragic view of life. But, which I think is very similar to Ricky Gervais in so many ways. Like we've played that clip before of unsayable.
Come and give us your unpopular opinion.
Yeah. And what was Gervais's unpopular opinion?
Oh, human beings are a plague, and the world would be better if they weren't here.
Right.
I hope we all die.
Yeah. With this cheery, chappy bonhomie. Right. That is the Ricky Gervais shtick.
Yeah.
That is the Slavoj Zizek shtick in so many ways. But we thought we'd play you two different clips of the ways in which he has noticed that Christianity has shaped the West. First, we're going to have a look at a clip taken from a kind of a debate/dialogue that Zizek did with Jordan Peterson as they debated socialism. But in the midst of it, he just sort of dropped this truth bomb about what Christianity is really like, and I thought it was fascinating.
Something unheard of, and I, as an atheist, accept the spiritual value of it, happens in Christianity. In other religions, you have God up there, we fall from God, and then we try to climb back through spiritual discipline, whatever, training, good deeds, and so on and so on. The formula of Christianity is a totally different one. As we philosophers would have put it, you don't climb to God. God, you are free in a Christian sense when you discover that the distance that separates you from God is inscribed into God himself. That's why I agree with those intelligent theologists, like my favorite, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who said that the cross, the crucifixion, is something absolutely unique, because in that moment of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, Father, why have you abandoned me? For a brief moment, symbolically, God himself becomes an atheist, in the sense of, you get a gap there. And that is something so absolutely unique.
So God himself becomes an atheist at the cross. What do you make of that?
Bizarre, quite frankly. So yeah, hard to know what to make of that. I mean, he's in his identification of the difference of Christianity with other faiths, and the idea of other faiths or spirituality say climb up to the top, and Christianity says no, God comes down. He's absolutely bang on there. In a way in a way so clear, that he's more clear on that than lots of people are.
Yes.
Yes. Who've written lots of books about Christianity
and who claim to be Christians.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a strange.
Yeah.
Where he goes with that is strange. God becomes an atheist.
Because he points to Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? Which is interesting. Certainly you can say from that Christ enters into the very depths of our hell, of our curse, of our estrangement, of the judgment of God. But the fact that he says, my God, means he hasn't lost faith.
No, it doesn't seem like that.
Yeah.
And
it's often pointed out that, Psalms were only called Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, like 1,000 years ago. Before that, they would just refer to the first line of the psalm. And when you said, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's also the title for Psalm 22. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of encompasses everything that's going on in Psalm 22, which is an incredible prophecy of the cross. And you've got, my hands and feet have been pierced, and a band of evil men surround me, and they're telling me come down from the cross, and all that kind of amazing prophecy. But it ends with a note of triumph. People in a future generation will say, he did it. So you can go too far with, the cry of dereliction, as it's called.
Yeah, sure.
And you can kind of say, Jesus lost all hope on the cross. He didn't lose all hope on the cross. He was saying, my God. But in the middle of that thing, Zizek says that the distance between us and God was inscribed into God's own being at the cross. I think that's a pretty cool way of putting it, actually.
Yeah.
Whatever distance there is between you and God, Jesus has bridged the gulf. The trouble for Zizek is it's kind of you don't climb to God. God comes down and dies.
And stays down. Yeah. Because in another video when he goes on and he says, there is no resurrection. There's a resurrection in the spirit,
right?
In the sense, not even. You said
in the church.
The church is the resurrection
in the power of the spirit.
But Jesus is dead and didn't actually rise in any real way.
Yeah. God's gone.
Yeah. And that's what freedom is. That you're now free to do.
Yes.
To struggle along by yourself was kind of his thing.
Yes. Yeah. So it seems without the resurrection, you're totally stuffed, aren't you? I often say when I'm preaching on the resurrection, to have a cross without a resurrection would be like you're sinking in quicksand, and you say, "Somebody help me!" and somebody comes to the quicksand and says, "I'm here to rescue you." They dive in and sink like a stone in front of you.
It's a bit like that video of that truck that drops the boat in the water and falls in, and then the other truck comes to lift it out and falls in. And eventually there's 3 lorries all stuck.
Right. If there's no one now to lift you out, and I loved those. When I was a child, I used to think that quicksand must be everywhere because all these sort of adventure stories.
So, that's very true.
It always happens. You see this scene of a guy struggling, and then cuts away, and then cuts back to the guy. You just see a hat.
Yeah, classic.
He's gone. But if you're there struggling in quicksand and your rescuer sinks without a trace, you're kind of sad for him. You're mainly sad for you, though, in that moment.
That's true.
But I think Zizek, he feels free. He's like, well, got God off our backs, haven't we?
Yeah.
As we sink down.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So he's got some things right. And as you say, he has identified the difference between Christianity and other faiths, in that the direction of travel is not us climbing up to God, but him coming down to us, and that has built the Western world in so many ways, I think, and I think we'll see how that's been shaped in our next clip. So there's a lecture that Zizek has. You can find it online. We'll put a link in the show notes on Christian atheism. And he goes into a little bit of a spiel about predestination and how it is that predestination has shaped our view of God and virtue and life. Let's have a look at that.
Insight also of the big Protestant topic of predestination. You mean God was simply playing a brutal game with us? He didn't care. God decided in advance, you are redeemed, you are lost, totally irrespective of what we are doing. And I think this is the right line. I think that as intelligent Protestants saw it, this Catholic way of linking our salvation to our good works introduces immediately an element of handling, of financial transaction. I see that child drowning, should I do it or not? Well, I may gain salvation, so it, why not do it, you know? It makes our good deeds part of a almost, I would say, financial investment into future, no? But as Luther put it very intelligently, if there is predestination, then the solution is pure goodness. Because you see a child drowning, sorry for this pathetic example, and you know very well that it will not help your salvation in any way if you help the child or not. So it's only goodness that makes you that.
Yep, pure goodness. As opposed to, so if you think you're earning your salvation, what are you going to be walking around the world trying to do?
Well, so yeah, and his example there, isn't it, that you might help the child who's drowning, but it's with that kind of thing in the back of your head going, but this is really for me, because I'm trying to in some way earn my way, climb my way up to God. But when you've had that taken away, that notion that you need to earn your way up, and that either you've been, I guess, he's using the example of predestined, isn't he? So you've been chosen, or I guess we would want to talk more clearly about grace.
By grace alone.
By grace,
you know.
yeah, grace alone. You can do those deeds altruistically, I suppose, in some sense, you know, although I'm not sure we ever do anything completely altruistically, but but it frees you from that kind of, I'm doing these things. You're doing it for the sake of goodness, you know, be good for goodness sake, you know.
Yeah.
It's that thing, isn't it?
The Christmas Carol.
Exactly.
Already.
Yeah. So, and I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because that is something that's kind of permeated thought, because people are very kind of critical, aren't they, of people who do things for their own benefit. Right. You know, it's like, yeah, well, it might help someone, but really you were doing it to build yourself up or to be seen by others or whatever it is. So
we've got a very developed sense that it's just hypocritical to do something to be seen by others. You're like, where do we get that sense from? And I think Zizek is interesting because he obviously will point to Jesus and say, you know, have you ever read the Sermon on the Mount? It's basically don't do anything for anyone else. You know, we naturally hide our sins and make our righteousness public. And literally Jesus says, no, do the opposite.
Sure.
like come clean with your sin and keep your righteousness private, which nobody naturally does. Like we're always, you know, self-justifying fools. But it really was the Protestant Reformation that kind of brought that out. And Luther in particular saw the toxicity of self-justification that just winds its way through every kind of aspect of your life. But I mean, Luther was not really into predestination. I mean, he believed in it, but like he was like, we don't know about predestination. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about the gospel. Let's talk about grace alone. So I don't know where Zizek's getting this stuff about. Luther's always on about predestination. Actually, he was always on about, like, don't spend too long looking at predestination.
Right, yeah.
You'll go a little bit crazy. But Zizek's, I mean, one of Luther's great phrases is, God does not need your good deeds, your neighbor does. And as soon as you got this understanding that God has closed the gap between heaven and earth, and now I'm totally cool vertically, now the only kind of reason to be good is horizontally. Like, it's out of a fullness that I flow out to the world. And I think it has built the modern world in so many ways. We've got this sense of even economically, like free grace leads to free markets. And I think a really good case can be made that the teaching of Jesus that's been understood by the church is that he gives us talents, which is a currency in the Bible, but it's money that you're not meant to bury. You're meant to actually invest it and pass it on because you've got a generous master. And that kind of breaks the habits of like all civilizations before that, because what people used to do with money was they would either hide it away or they would build great statues to themselves and display it and say, check out my bling. And it was just for ostentation. And of course, people still do both those things today. But there's a third thing you can do, which Jesus taught and which the Reformation really zeroed in on, is you can actually put it to work, invest it, get it out there. And so, for better or for worse, capitalism is kind of...
Well, yeah. But even money, people might say, people who are squirreling that money away, they're not doing anything with it. But what we mean by squirreling it away is keeping it in the bank. Yeah. Not, and that's doing what we're talking about, because the bank take your money. It doesn't just sit in a vault, does it? They give it out to others. Yeah. They invest in businesses or whatever they give a loan, and it kind of works a bit like that, doesn't it? So unless you're sticking it in the mattress, that's which
people used to do.
That used to be the thing. That's the difference, isn't it? I suppose. So.
Yeah. And so it's really that sense of receiving the free gift and passing it on, and it has built the modern world in so many ways, and it's built it morally, such that we have this sense that we don't do good to be ostentatious. We do good just out of the kindness of my own heart. Which is why I think Ricky Gervais is a great example of, like, the reason why so much of his comedy works is because he's doing the opposite of that. Like, David Brent is just a selfish so-and-so who loves comic relief because he gets to stand with a big check and get into the local newspaper, And so this clip from Comic Relief is just hilarious, I think. What a monster. Yeah.
It's good stuff, though. I do enjoy that it is that first kind of section. There was a first section of it where you're going, is this a genuine thing? And you're like, oh, it's not genuine. Like,
am I meant to feel something?
Am I watching an actual segment from Comic Relief?
Or am I chuckling at a real genuine tragedy? Am I as much of a misanthrope as Ricky Gervais? No. But yeah, that idea that you do stuff just to be seen to be doing it. Like, totally commonplace in the Roman world. Like, totally commonplace, like, in all these other worldviews. And then you get Jesus and says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Yeah. Do it in secret. Your father knows what you're doing in secret. Yeah, your father's cool with you. So now, out you go. So I think, to that degree, Zizek has put his finger on some things that have built the modern world, and they are distinctively Christian.
Absolutely.
But let's move on to another Christian atheist. And Douglas Murray often self-identifies as a Christian atheist. He used to be a Christian, and then in his 20s kind of walked away from an Anglican faith. But I wonder, where that journey will take him. Because he recognizes absolutely that where we've come from is very distinctively Christian.
There's something incredibly deep has happened underneath our societies, which we're in, if not in denial about, we don't face up to, which is we're living at a stage where we might be among the first people in human history to have absolutely no explanation for what we're doing here. And no story to tell about what we should do.
It's very hard to live as a complete nihilist. It's very hard to live as somebody who actually believes that there's absolutely no purpose to what we're doing. Now, the crossroads then is, are we hardwired to believe there is meaning and there is meaning, or are we simply meaning-searching beings and there may be no meaning? Now, if we are meaning-seeking beings, it's probably a very bad idea to say we are meaning-seeking beings and there is no meaning. Something intrinsic in us tells us that our lives are not as purposeless as that. But the big void that it opens up is then, what are we doing? And the only thing that can answer that, as I see it, are religions. That doesn't mean that religions are true. It doesn't mean that specific religions are true. But there's no doubt about it, I completely concede the point that the only thing that can address that fully is going to be a religion.
There are things which atheists miss and are, I think, very worried about admitting that they miss. The German philosopher who Rowan Williams has already quoted tonight, Jürgen Habermas, coined the term a few years ago. A beautiful term, it's worth bearing in mind. He said he wrote an essay called The Awareness of What is Missing. He just posits the fact that in the secular state, with an atheist mindset, there are some things you miss. And the non-religious very rarely want to mention this. But there are things that they miss. If we were to get rid of religion entirely in the 21st century, very many people, not only themselves would miss it very deeply, but there would be all sorts of questions which people have in their lives, which would remain, if not completely unanswered, then answered incredibly quietly. Secularism and atheism have all sorts of truths to argue, but their voice is very quiet on many things that matter to many people. The voice of atheism is at least quiet in the face of death, in the face of human tragedy, of suffering. It has very little to say to people who seek, for instance, some kind of reconciliation or forgiveness or repentance, all sorts of things which religious traditions have addressed. Believe it is true or not, religion provided, and I would say provides and will provide in the future, an opportunity for people to ask serious questions about themselves, ask serious questions about the universe and their existence. To quote Larkin, he says in Churchill, "A serious house on serious earth this is, wherein whose blend all our compulsions meet." Richard Dawkins said at the very opening, "Is it true?" That was what you said you wanted to address. No. And yes. No, it is not true. It is not literally true. But can religion carry truth? Yes. Schopenhauer says in his dialogue on religion, he says, truth may be like water. It needs a vessel to carry it. We don't have very many vessels. And if you believe that we can go into the 21st century not only saying we don't need a vessel ourselves, but nobody else should have one, I don't believe that would be a period of greater understanding.
Even if people aren't believers, there are things that they can learn from religion and from tradition. And I've always thought that there's one central insight to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I wish that the social justice warriors bore in mind, and that's the Garden of Eden, and the what Kant would call the crooked timber of humanity. Just to recognize the central truth which is in that tradition and in others, that we're not born in this situation of Rousseauian perfection or goodness. Quite otherwise, we are this very, very contorted being, which is capable of incredible greatness, and beauty, and kindness, and forgiveness, and also capable of their opposites. And that it's not that you are one and other people are the other, but that all of us are both all the time. And so there never is a victory and there never is a win, other than trying to deal with and restrain your own worst impulses in the life that you have.
I mean, I'm not asking people to be believing Christians. I'm not a believing Christian. But one of the things I say is we are Christians anyway, whether we like it or not, and we're probably finding that out at the moment. I mean, where the hell do people think that human rights came from? Yeah. We still have a lot of the structure of the Christian faith and the Judeo-Christian religion, but without the answers that it provides. So that we have all of the thing of guilt, but there is no way to alleviate guilt. There is no redemption. There is only the guilt. Yeah. It's totally shallow. Who says, God, I just can't wait to lead my tolerant, diverse life? Yeah. It answers none of the questions which we as people, as human beings, and as souls ask. And so we have this strange thing where the culture says nothing to you, and it has no reason for what we're doing. I don't say it because of any proselytizing desire. God knows. But I think you cannot take Christianity out of the West and have anything that's recognizably the West. Because, as I've often said, citing the radical atheist priest, theologian Don Cupid, even the dreams we dream are still Christian dreams.
There are a lot of people who say, well, I'm totally opposed to what Islam's doing. And then they say, I'm a secular, rational atheist.
No, they're a secular, rational Christian atheist.
Right.
They may not want to be, but they are.
Yeah.
They still dream Christian dreams.
Yeah.
They still have Christian thoughts and impulses.
Yeah. So whether we like it or not, we're Christians, I guess. And he would say that to an incredibly secular audience and people who would consider themselves to be atheists. But he would say, no, you're an atheist. You're a Christian atheist.
And the things that they hold on to, such as the human rights thing, is saying, well, that is an inherently Christian belief. That has come from Christian things. And if you want to cling to human rights, you are clinging to a Christian worldview, even if you've chucked away Christ, and God. And I think that's the interesting thing, is both with Murray and Slavoj, is that there's this sense, isn't there, that it's so deep in our culture that we almost don't see it.
Yes.
Yes. It's so obvious. You can't see the forest for the trees, kind of thing. Yeah. Reminds me a bit of that. You must have seen the video, probably. Where they say there's the white team and the black team, and they're going to count how many times the white team. Yeah. All right, Glen.
Sorry. Gave it away.
And they say watch the video, watch the white team. How many times do they pass the ball? And then you do it, and you kind of go, I think it was 16 or something. Yeah. And then they go, but it says at the end, did you see the dancing gorilla? Yeah. And you're like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And then you watch it back, and actually this guy dances through the middle of the thing dressed as a gorilla, right in the bang smack in the middle of the frame, not even hidden. Yeah. But you didn't notice because you weren't focused on it. And again, it's that thing. It's so much in plain sight. And, some people would really rile against this kind of thing, wouldn't they? They say, I'm not a Christian. I think Christian is terrible. And there's another clip we've got of Murray we've used in something else where the guy says, I think Christianity is the enemy of the West. Mm-hmm. And Murray basically says, well, if you take Christianity out of the West, what you've got left isn't recognisably the West. Yeah. But, it's so... It is the kind of the water we swim in, so much so that you're almost oblivious to it, or people are oblivious to it. Yeah. And pointing out to people, that this is actually a Christian thing is kind of news to people, really. Right. They assume it's a universal. Right.
Which itself is testimony to how Christian they are. They think it's a universal. Why do you think the whole world operates according to this logos? This understanding, this meaning, this, even our criticisms of Christianity are Christian, So, and we're thinking about things like human rights, which it's true to say, if we step away from that belief, we step away from civilization as we know it. To think that somebody possesses dignity and value simply because they're a member of the human family, not because of anything they contribute. That's just being a nice person, right? That's just the foundation of morality. And you're like, well, that's not what other peoples have thought in the past.
It's the assumptions thing, isn't it? That people will just assume. Well, people who would not identify as Christians will assume, of course, everybody has a value, everybody's equal, and then you kind of pick away, and you want to say, okay, but I can say that because as a Christian, I believe people are made in the image of God, and therefore there is that kind of divine, dignity about all people. So that's my foundation. What's your foundation?
Yeah.
And that's when you can try and chip away. That's why I find this stuff really interesting, because it is really kind of questioning people's foundations and assumptions.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in our discussions with non-Christians, we almost start too far along the line, and sometimes it's just winding it back and say, people might ask us a question, and actually sometimes it's better to come back with a question, very Christ-like anyway, and just say, okay, but you're saying about, maybe they're asking you something about, isn't it bad that this happens, or but where'd you get that concept of good or bad, or or that these people deserve X, Y, and Z?
Yes.
And just trying to unpick stuff like that.
Yes.
And the interesting thing, I think that's the interesting thing, is that's kind of something that's happening here in the West, isn't it? That as people have wanted, I suppose, for quite a while to have the Christian values without Christ.
Right.
And that's kind of been okay for a while. That's kind of just about limped along. Yeah. But it seems like we're at a phase where that's beginning to fall apart a little bit. Yeah. Because people are kind of going, but why? Right. Why should I believe these? Right. These people are equal, or that, this, that, and the other. If there's no real foundation. Right.
Right. And it seems like, what Douglas Murray might say in a book like The Madness of Crowds is that we've got these hyper-Christian ideas of equality, diversity, inclusion, which are precious ideas when grounded in, a larger story. But when they're just sort of taken out of the Christian story, and then it just becomes, identity politics and intersectionality and the oppression Olympics and all this kind of stuff that Douglas Murray would say is tearing us apart. In a sense, it's hyper Christian. It's woke, right? And what is it to be woke? It's to be awakened. It's another great awakening. It's a spiritual movement. It's reformation, as Tom Holland would say.
The scales fell from my eyes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Educate yourself. Come back to the light.
Totally.
But be awakened to this spiritual renewal that's going to convulse society and bring about new birth, and yet it's the kingdom without a king, and Douglas Murray is very worried, and a lot of people are very worried that we're just going to tear ourselves over nothing and tear ourselves apart, and then have nothing as a center, to hold us, because something like equality, diversity, inclusion, it's great medicine, it's terrible food. You need something far more solid. And I'm going to ask Douglas Murray in our interview in just a few minutes. In fact, I'm going to be interviewing him and asking him, what is your hope for actually depoliticizing people? Because he wants to, let's stop being so caught up in identity politics. Let's find a different, center to our lives. Let's unite around something. You're like, okay, what? Because we've got this story that did build the West, and it did a good job of it. Maybe we need to get back to it.
Absolutely.
So we'll see what happens on Douglas's journey. But the third person we wanted to have a look at when it comes to Christian atheism is to speak of the secular historian Tom Holland, and to figure out what's going on with him, because he seems to be making a journey in a different direction to Douglas Murray. It's his investigation into the culture of the West and the water that we all swim in that actually led him back to some very Christian distinctives. Let's have a look at a couple of clips. The first of which is where he explains to Tom Wright his journey to figuring out where our values in the West come from. And then in our second clip, we're going to have a look at him to A.C. Grayling, who challenges him to talk about, what is it that Christianity has distinctively given to the West? Can you name just one thing? Yeah, Tom Holland can name more than one thing.
Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more. And it was kind of like, I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply, deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of urbane man with his property problems. Paul never had any property; he just made tents. Yes. That in almost every what is it, seven? That is the 7 letters that are people conventionally people absolutely accept. That and as Tom Wright was saying, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted. Yes,
but also the way that the West has then moved on to shape, concepts like international law, for instance. So the fact, concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists
Paul really
and atheists,
his letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of came out, as it were, and said, as far as my values and background are concerned, I am a Christian. It was interesting to see the response to that, because I saw lots of atheists and humanists saying, "Oh, hang on, democracy, that goes back to the Greeks. Don't pretend that Christianity gave us everything we're grateful for." But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to the Judeo-Christian?
I think. If we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world, and it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're, in Corinth or Alexandria. And then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards. And, by the time you get to the 11th century in Latin Christendom, everything has changed. And you have this, I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history. So the 11th century, with the Papal Revolution, essentially it establishes this idea that society has to be reborn, reconfigured, that vested interests have to be torn down. And then the Reformation, what we call the Reformation, is a further ripple effect of that, and the Enlightenment is a further ripple effect of that. And very interesting. It's spilled out so much that now in the 21st century we don't even realise where these ripple effects are coming from. We just take them for granted.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge?
Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are, and essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are the property of all humanity.
So I always enjoy that clip because it always reminds me so much of the life of Brian. And, but what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, there's the aqueduct, isn't there? Oh yeah, but apart from the aqueduct, yeah, or the roads, apart from the aqueduct and the roads, it's just like that, isn't it? And he's like, I'd like just one thing. Give me one thing in any realm, and he kind of very delves deeply to see metaphysical anything. Yeah. And Tom's just like bang, bang, bang,
and he gives 7, which is such a Christian answer.
So brilliant to kind of watch, but. I mean, Tom Holland's another one, isn't he? Who's, through his book Dominion of late has kind of just shown how everything that we hold dear in the West is pretty much built upon Christian values.
So what do we do with that? In our own personal witness to people, how do we make use of Slavoj or Douglas or Tom? What are some of the moves that we can make in making Christianity both appealing to people and calling them to Christ?
I'm sure there's lots of ways, and maybe some of it touched upon earlier. Just there's a lot of assumptions that where people will assume, hey, we're just to be good, nice people and love other people and be kind, and of course people are valuable and equal and stuff. And you go, okay, I agree with you. But what is your basis for that? Yeah. Because it seems to me that you've taken the basis out of it. And I think there's another part of another interview Tom Holland does with James Delingpole, where he says something at the same. But I think the same thing he said in his interview with you. Once you've got rid of those foundations, you say to someone, someone does something terrible, and you turn around and say, "Hey, I think what you said is racist," and that person turns around and says, "Yeah, I'm a racist. Yeah, so what? Yeah, like if you've got no foundation to kind of say what is good and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, or that all people are valuable regardless of race or gender or whatever, it's quite difficult to actually come back at that and condemn someone. For it. You've kind of got no recourse for that. And so it's kind of I think it's helping people to see that you already believe a lot of Christian things. Yes. Maybe that's the way you already believe a lot of Christian things, probably without even realizing it. And you can't just keep on believing that without Jesus, because once you take that away, the foundation falls apart. Right. And you've got no, and I'm sure maybe you could say to people, here's an example, why you and I think this is wrong, but why is it wrong?
It's like, in the interview I did with Tom, he talked about how, like, if you believe that the evolutionary process was always aiming to get us to the stage where we write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is as theological, belief. If you think that human rights are out there
in the
ether, and that we have somehow evolved to kind of correspond to this Platonic ideal called human rights, that is as theological a claim as that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of the Father. And what's fascinating is that so many people say, "Oh, I don't have the faith to believe in Jesus." And you're like, "Well, you've got the faith to believe in all sorts of stuff, right?" But what it is that you're believing in actually has no foundation. You kind of believe in that belief, but why do you believe in that belief? So we're all dealing in beliefs. And for some people who say, I believe in the metaphorical truth of the Christian story, but just not the metaphysical realities. That's quite a common thing that's said by, like Brett Weinstein, for instance, will talk about this metaphorical truth to religion. Douglas Murray will talk about this metaphorical truth to religion. It's not true, but it is true. But at that stage, if you're going to wager your life on living in a cross-shaped way, if you're going to keep your righteousness hidden and pour yourself out for the poor and the vulnerable and the weak, and if you're going to identify with the oppressed and not with the oppressor, why are you going to do that? Like, if you are just worm food in 70 years' time, like, why would you do that? If you're just this biological, this bag of protoplasm, why would you walk the Jesus way without having faith in the resurrection,
something beyond it
that vindicates that way and will raise you up? In that sense, they've got more faith than I've got. They've got, they're living out kind of the ethic of Jesus, but without the reality behind it and without the hope of the resurrection. So
doesn't Tom Holland draw an interesting comparison? I'm trying to think what the two things he compares are. One of them was environmentalism, and I can't remember exactly what he pitted it against, but he was kind of saying, I think it was just against this idea of everyone being valuable and kind of having this dignity, that we all kind of agree that, but yet interestingly he talked about environmentalism and like how people are actually bad for the planet
if you're a plague, as Ricky Gervais has taught us.
Exactly. It's very much like the Ricky Gervais thing. And the best thing we could do for the environment, if people are having this terrible impact, would be just get rid of the people. But of course there are voices in the environmental side of things who would say that, but they're very much on the fringes, and we look at that and go, no, like it's a bad thing. But he was saying, you've kind of got these things that are playing against each other, but we kind of know that like just getting rid of all human beings is a bad thing, because we do have this thing ingrained in us that there is human dignity and value in all lives. And he just pulls out lots of little things. You kind of go, oh, that's really interesting. That's so deep in us. But
totally. But I think it's said more and more boldly by environmentalists. Certainly to the point where just don't have another kid, right? Because that kid will impact your carbon footprint more than more than never going on holiday again and staycations forever.
Well, and the thing that I suppose not just in environmentalism but just in general, another thing he pulls out about how we've been so influenced by the Christian world is the idea of how you treat the ones who don't agree with you, the heretic. And how Christians obviously get a lot of flack for what has happened over the years in terms of there's those who believe the right things and those who don't, and those who don't are the heretics and they end up being burnt or whatever. And people go, oh, look what Christians have done, they've done these terrible things. But yet that idea of there being the right thing and you punish those on the outside in some way, it comes through, he said, like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the culture wars of today. So actually you see it all the time on Twitter, like everyone's saying like, hey, we should be loving and tolerant of people and inclusive, but you're a hateful bigot, punch a Nazi, let's do this, kill them, dox them, I don't care if so and so dies, and it's all that thing about like, and he says even that he's kind of saying has come out of this idea that there's a truth that is truth for everyone, the reality, there is the real truth, and then there are those who are going against that. So even that's fascinating to see, like what he says there.
Which is why, getting back to a doctrine of original sin, which Tom Holland kind of talks about as well, is so important as well. The baddie is within me, not just the guy over there who I need to exclude. But all of this stuff I think helps when you're talking to someone who says, I just couldn't believe, I could never believe the Christian truth claims. And you're just like, you believe so many metaphysical truth claims that actually don't make sense without the actual physical resurrection of Jesus. And Paul van der Klee is, he's often, called the pastor to the intellectual dark web. He's got a great YouTube channel commenting on Jordan Peterson and loads of other people like him. But he just made this throwaway line in one video, and I'm not sure he said it again, but I've been thinking about it for the last year or two. He said, if the resurrection is true, it's true at every level of analysis. And what he meant by that is a Jordan Peterson type person will say, expend yourself, speak the truth, and even though they crucify you for it, who knows? Something might. This is the way of virtue. This is the way forward. And he would, in that instance, want you to live in a quite Christian way. And people who have taken his words on faith and lived in that way are kind of living lives of faith, and trusting that there is some way forward in doing that. And I'm just wanting to say to such people, you are living out a Christian kind of a life and almost a Christian belief in resurrection. But if that is really true, and you're staking your life on it, if that is really true, then it's going to be true at every level of analysis. And so it's not just metaphorically true. It's also metaphysically true. It's also historically true. This really is Christ's universe. And one of the evidences that this is Christ's universe is the way in which he has built the world just like he said he would. I just find it fascinating. You go to Matthew 16, for instance, and Jesus is like, yeah, I'm going to build my kingdom on this guy Peter and his proclamation of me as the Christ, and the gates of hell won't even, make a dent on our kingdom. In fact, we're going to overrun the gates of hell. Yeah. Says this, retired carpenter age 33, to a bunch of losers, and he says Peter's going to be my spokesman. Yeah, we're going to take over the world. You're not going to take, but he did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he totally did it. And then the other parable I'm always thinking of is Mark chapter 4. Having talked about the parable, the scattered seed across all the different soil types, and the birds at the beginning of Mark chapter 4 are identified with Satan, evil, opposed to Christ, and they gobble up the seed. But he keeps sowing the seed, and the kingdom grows. And then he tells another couple of parables about this growing kingdom that's going to take over the world. And then he talks. It's like the mustard seed that's the smallest seed, and it grows into the biggest plant. And even the birds perch in the branches of this growing seed. So that which began opposing the word ends up somehow inhabiting the world that Christ has built, and I do see that as kind of speaking to the ways in which everybody's far more Christian than they think, even those who think of themselves as opposed to Christ and the word of Christ. They're sitting on a branch.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Of the tree that Christ grew, and again, he's speaking that parable in his early 30s, And the reason why he doesn't get out of his early 30s is he's crucified as a blasphemer and a criminal. Why? How on earth has he built the modern world?
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing to think about, isn't it? That when we look at the things Jesus says, we kind of go, to us, it seems self-evident that these are good and right things.
Yeah.
But when he said it in his day, this was blasphemous and terrible, and we had to get rid of him.
Yeah.
Nuts.
Nuts.
It was that countercultural.
Yeah.
It wasn't that the Romans were living like this anyway, or the Roman Empire was that way, and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why Zizek and his stuff on the cross is, it does bring you up short, and it's helpful as a Christian to see the cross again through Zizek's eyes. When he talks about, Christ became an atheist, I don't think he became an atheist, but he's pointing to the radical nature of Jesus doing something totally different. And the fact that we've completely pacified the cross and domesticated it just shows what a revolution it's done on us.
Well, and Tom Holland, again, he talks about in the Delingpole interview about being in, I can't remember exactly where he was, but where IS were not far from, and see where he was, and they were actually crosses
Shinja
up
or something,
something like that, and there were crosses that were up that had been used weeks before to crucify men, and he said, every time we see the cross, we just think of the cross as this kind of symbol of hope. It's on an ambulance or whatever it is. It's this or the actual cross, kind of this symbol of life and things in the And he said, and then he was confronted with the idea of the cross without any of that, actually as a weapon of torture and execution. And he said, and actually that's a very terrifying world. But I mean, that's just not how we see it at all. Because again, we're so in the Christian world.
That of course the strong should serve the weak, and of course you should sacrifice, and of course a king should put himself under the law, and like what? No, it's only because he did that.
I'm the king. What?
So you go back to that. There is the crucifixion. There is the Roman centurion with a spear, thrusting it up into the Son of God's side, and like on either end of that spear are two totally different visions of power. You've got the centurion, who is the emissary of Roman power, who will crush the opposition and crush that which is weak. And then you've got Christ, the victim. And you're like, who does the world belong to? Belongs to Jesus. And history has borne that out. Lots of things bear that out. Scripture bears it out. Reason, I would say, bears it out. All sorts of things, but history bears it out.
Yeah. There's no Roman Empire now.
Right. No. Right, yeah, and Jesus is Lord. Well, we hope that's been helpful for you as you think through talking to your friends. They are far more believing than they might believe themselves to be. So let's keep talking about where all these things come from. Let's keep talking about Jesus. Well, stay tuned for more about Reset. We're going to have some fantastic interviews for you. If you're not subscribed already to our YouTube channel, we are Speak Life Media on YouTube. We are Speak Life UK on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Do keep up with us, because I'm sure you're going to want to hear more about this very exciting series. But it's great to be in person, isn't it?
Yeah, really good to be back in the building.
Back in the saddle. And we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Take care.